Welcome back, guys, to another video and another format actually. In the past couple of days I've been thinking what I want to do on my channel, and I had this idea that I want to show you the recent developments in opening theory. And since now currently the World Chess Championship is happening, I thought it would be a nice idea just to go through the opening ideas which have been played, and there have been actually quite a lot of them. And yeah, so I would like to just show you the ideas which have been played and how to react against them, because usually what happens in a World Championship match is that many of the opening ideas which are played will also appear in other tournament games, because it's kind of an influential match, and therefore people tend to play the same as the contender and the world champion himself. So I picked a couple of the games which I felt were interesting. The first one is the second game of the match. I already did do a recap about the whole game, but as I said, in this format I would only like to talk about the opening, since it's also kind of my specialty, I would say, and the things that do interest me the most. So let's jump right into it. In the first game, in the second game of the match, Ding played e4, and we had the Italian, and Ding went for this very interesting, I wouldn't even call it a sideline by now, with knight c3. The main Italian is just with white going short castle and then usually c3. But knight c3 is another basically completely different way of approaching the position. Now black has a couple of ideas here how to play. The main thing is that what white wants is that when black goes d6, he wants knight a4, and then white will win the bishop pair. I have to say though, I will reveal something here, is that I actually checked d6 myself with the black pieces, so I would go d6 here. And what I checked was, or what I think is best here, is after knight a4, bishop b6. White usually delays taking on b6, even though sooner or later a position like this will come. So a3 is usually played. The idea is that white wants to gain space on the queen side with b4. And here there was a nice idea in this position, which has been reached still a couple of times, which is a6. So this was my preparation a couple of weeks ago for, I don't even remember which game. I think it was during the European Individual Championship. And after a6, now the bishop finally threatens to retreat to a7, so now white has to take on b6. And here b5 followed by bishop e6 is coming, for example, like this. This was a game between Wesley So and Denis Lazovic, and black has very nice counterplay here with b5. So this is what I would play with the black pieces, just let white take the bishop pair. And white also did lose some time here with knight a4, knight b6, and in general here the bishop pair doesn't matter that much yet, I would say, since the position is still pretty closed. Ding Liren played, Gukesh with the black pieces played a6, which does have the point that that black wants to prepare simply going d6 without a long knight a4. This is one of the moves. h6 is another pretty serious idea, and here again white is so flexible. But in general, white will go for a position with bishop e3, allowing black to capture, and after d6, there is this interesting idea for white to delay short castle. When, for example, this game I picked between Mamedov and Kukulos, both very strong grandmasters, white does have this idea with long castle, and this tends to be pretty dangerous. Here already black is in quite a lot of trouble, because the main idea is just to push g4 at some point, and black's attack is not really going anywhere. On the other hand, white's attack is coming pretty quickly with g4. Another approach after h6 is just to go a3, still kind of waiting around for black maybe to go a6, since after d6 again knight a4 would be an option, and after a6 only then to go bishop e3, with the inclusion of a3 and a6, which maybe favors white in some cases. But let's get back to the game. a6 was played in the game, and here Ding went for a4, avoiding b5 in some positions, even though I always felt like a4 is somewhat of a mysterious move, because it also does weaken the b4 square. But it is what people play nowadays, and in general white will anyway castle on basically the next move, so maybe it would also make sense to castle right away with the white pieces. But Ding went a4, also bishop e3 right away is very sensible, and there's actually one kind of a trap here after after bishop takes e3, f takes e3, d6, there is knight g5, which was actually played between Bartel and Ariantari in the Polish league. I think it was last year. And after castle, short castle, black has to be quite accurate actually to defend this. h6 was played by Ariantari, but here after knight f7, actually it turns out that white is already winning because queen h5 is coming, and the game concluded in a couple of moves already. King g6 and now rook f6, queen f3, and rook f1 is coming, and white has a huge attack here, and it's actually objectively winning here already. But Ding played a4, and after d6 short castle, Gukesh went h6, possibly to not to allow bishop g5 here. So he went h6 before castle, and now bishop e3. And yeah, I thought this position is interesting, not only from a theoretical point, but also from an understanding, just from an understanding wise as well. So here Gukesh played bishop e6, still being in preparation. This I think is still a good decision. Bishop takes e3 is also fairly obvious, but now after f takes e3, bishop e6, white does have a couple of extra options with the bishop already being traded and the f file being opened. One of them is b3, which was played by Vladimir Kramnik, which is a nice idea, because now whenever black captures on c4, white can capture towards the center and has this very nice grip here in the center. Another idea is just to go for an immediate knight d5, which is probably also quite dangerous. Usually white has some ideas here with knight h4, sometimes even right away. Cannot recall here, but often when black takes this pawn, there might be a couple of things happening here. Also, you might think about taking here at queen f3 also looks interesting, targeting the knight and the pawn, and if the knight moves, b7 could be hanging. So there are quite a couple of interesting ideas here for white, but Gukesh went bishop e6, and now is the novelty game of the game, which is a5, and yeah, I think this is quite interesting, and we could definitely see it a couple of more times in the future. A5 is kind of like a waiting move, and in the long run, white wants to fix the structure on the queen side. So black does have some issues with the structure here sometimes. What has been played before, instead of a5, is bishop takes e6, and now this sort of structure, now a5, but here the main thing is that black is still able to castle to the queen side. So this was the game Saric against Dennis Wagner, and after queen e7, knight d2, black has the initiative on the king side with g4, h5 to come, and black can castle queen side where the king is actually quite safe. So a5 therefore is somewhat of a waiting move and still keeping the options. And if black were to castle now, white could go for this position here when black has already castled the king to the king side. So this would be one extra option here. But Gukesh decided to take on c4, and here he played the move castle when after bishop c5, dc5, b3. I will conclude my analysis here when Ding was a little bit better. It's still not the end of the world, but white has a nice advantage here because, again, the pawn on a5 is quite annoying for black since it clamps down the queen side, and the pawn on c5 is like a long-term target. Instead of short castle, I would suggest, it does look a bit strange, but bishop takes e3 might be, maybe a little bit less sad than this position, even though here also black is quite solid. And after f takes e3, there is this important idea with knight b8. So the knight is coming around to d7, maybe short castle first is more accurate. And then it's important for black to regroup the knight to c5, just to attack the pawn on e4. Still, this position is playable, and I would probably prefer white here, simply because white can just go something like queen e1, followed by knight h4, f5, and it still seems like black's king is somewhat weak here. So yeah, this a5 idea is quite interesting. Also, what you have to check here, if you play this with white, is the move bishop b4, just threatening to take here on c3, and then the e4 pawn will drop, and also the pawn on a5 is hanging. So here, knight d5, knight takes e4, queen d3, knight c5, this is the computer line, queen f5, knight d6, and it's a very strange position. Queen g4 apparently is the move, not allowing or kind of discouraging black from casting short, and the position is just a total mess. Like there are many possible outcomes here. The bishop on b4 is somewhat in danger. Yeah, white can maybe play c3. So this position is definitely interesting, and I can totally understand why Gukesh didn't go there. and therefore we went for castle, and again this position did happen in the game. But to conclude my analysis here, since I said that I want to also propose one possible way to play against these systems, my favorite way is to play just d6 and just to allow knight a4 when I think that black is just pretty solid here. I never really liked these positions when bishop e3 came and the FL opens up. I think these are a bit easier to play for white. Now the next theoretical kind of a novelty, not really a novelty, but a very new variation, which was played in game 3 of the match, is this idea with queen c2 here. So the game started with d4, Gukesh had the white pieces. So again, it was here it was a Gukesh idea. d4, knight f6, knight f3, d5, c4, e6. And here, instead of knight c3, Gukesh went for c takes d5. The point is that after knight c3, black does have many options here. For example, he could go for the very forcing Tarrasch, also d takes c4, the Vienna is one option, which tends to be also very forcing. And if black is very well prepared here, he could just easily like, head the game towards his analyzed waters. So c takes d5 is kind of it has been played already in the last couple of years. So black just wants to get this this Carlsbad structure, even though the knight is already on f3, which is not always that great, because if we look at this variation here, the classical Queen's Gambit, often white wants to develop with e3, bishop d3, and then knight e2. But of course, this move order has the downside that black can go for the Nimzo Indian, which is a very serious defense. So this is the position we have in front of us, knight c3, c6, and here Gukesh went queen c2, simply with the point to stop black from playing bishop f5. Now g6 was played, which is the main move. You could also ask what happens after bishop e7. Now bishop g5 would again lead to some more of main lines. There are these variations like castle e3, h6, bishop h4, rook e8, and after bishop d3, black usually goes knight e4 in some cases, when black is also pretty solid. But after bishop e7, I guess that Gukesh's idea could have been to go h3. Again, the point is to prepare bishop f4, since bishop f4 right away could step into knight h5, when the bishop most likely has to retreat again if he doesn't want to lose the bishop pair. So h3, I suspect, could have been Gukesh's idea, when after short castle, the bishop can get out to f4, and after e3, bishop d3, white might be able to claim a small advantage here. But g6 was played, and now h3, this is kind of the starting position of Gukesh's idea. Bishop g5 has been played in the past as well, but after bishop e7, bishop could also go to g7, by the way, also possible. Now black will simply go bishop f5, and there's nothing much happening here. By the way, I'm just thinking here, there was a game which I saw, I think it was yesterday or 2 days ago, Nihal Sarin was white, and black played h6, and there's actually this trick here that white is winning a pawn here with knight takes d5, so black has to defend the knight here if bishop g5. Just wanted to mention that. But h3 was played, and now again, white's idea is to prepare bishop f4, without knight h5 happening, and also, as we will see, g4 sometimes can be an idea. Now Ding played bishop f5, queen b3 was played by Gukesh, queen b6, and now g4. This was Gukesh's idea after all, and yeah, this is surprisingly tricky for black. I analyzed this quite a bit, and it wasn't actually that easy to come up with something fully satisfactory. Queen takes b3 was played by Ding, but what I didn't like was that after a takes b3, bishop c2, again Ding's move, bishop f4, also bishop g2 is interesting. The bishop is somehow always kind of, it's not really happy here on c2, and it can often be trapped, which actually happened also in Ding's game. So here you need to memorize a lot, and therefore I didn't really like this variation. Of course, you could take on b3, and now moves like bishop e6 or also bishop e4 are possible, but again, it wasn't fully, I wasn't fully happy with that. So after g4, my suggestion here is to go bishop e6 immediately. The point is that black is still keeping the options if he wants to take on b3 or not. In most cases later on he will take, but it does have some advantages to not do that right away. After bishop e6, I checked a couple of moves. The first one would be queen c2, which was actually played in a correspondence game in 2023. when white would decide not to exchange queens, but here white also did lose a lot of time with the queen, so now just knight d7, bishop will come to g7, short castle, and yeah, bishop e3 was played in the correspondence game. I didn't understand it at all, but it seems like black already has the better position here, like white's pieces are all pretty strangely placed here. So queen c2 I think is a bit inhuman here. Bishop f4 or bishop g2 would be the main two ideas, and after bishop f4, here, I think that knight e4 is quite important. This is important to remember because now after bishop f4, white does often threaten to go bishop e5 when this pin could be quite unpleasant. So after bishop f4, I like knight e4, just immediately stepping out of this idea with bishop e5, and black now has the idea to take on b3, and after a b3 to go bishop e4, pinning the knight. So after knight e4, I checked a couple of moves. e3 is, I think, the most logical one, and here, as I said, black can take, go bishop e4, and after rook c1, knight d7, black does have the nice idea of going f6 and then g5 followed by h5, when it seemed like black has a very comfortable position here to me. Objectively, it's still around equal, but I was more than happy with this here. Instead of e3, again, queen c2 does look a bit strange, and black can just develop something like knight d7. He could also throw in h5 here, which was my main move here. And after rook g1, take knight d7. Yeah, the king on e1 is a little bit strange. It's not sure where it will go. Maybe it will just stay here. But black does have quite a lot of ideas. Even bishop g7 followed by c5 was one option, which I saw. Bishop d6 is also often an idea just to exchange this bishop. So usually black is pretty okay here. Also, this knight could come to f6. This looked pretty good for black. Yeah, instead of bishop f4, what I wanted to mention was bishop g2 is also one option, when now I like knight a6 much more, because now after knight bd7 there could come knight g5, I think it was here, which I did not want to allow, I think it was here. But here knight a6, now the bishop is not on f4, white doesn't have bishop e5, this is the main difference, and now if white goes bishop f4 now, black can take and now go bishop e7, so that now bishop e5 is again not a threat anymore. So overall, this h3 idea is quite interesting for white. I would even consider it playing myself, but I do like this idea, which I proposed with simply going bishop e6 right away, which seems like the most flexible approach. And you just have to watch out here for bishop f4, bishop e5 ideas. So here after bishop f4, the key move to remember is, I think, knight e4. And it seems like black is doing pretty okay here. Okay, so the next game I wanted to look at was the game 5 of the match, where Gukesh again had the white pieces. And in this game, Gukesh opted for the second time for the French defense, which as to date, now that I'm recording this, 9 games have been played. It was his last game where he played e4, and therefore the French defense appeared. And in this game, this was the second French defense. By the way, the first game where he played it, the first game of the match, he lost. In the first game, there happened knight c3, knight f6, and after e5, he played this line here with knight ce2, and then he played c3, f4, knight f3, and Ding won a nice game there. But in that game, in game 5, Gukesh went for the exchange variation, which has been quite topical, and therefore I also wanted to discuss this. And Ding went for knight f6. This is already kind of like the first point where black does have quite a lot of options. Knight f6 is the main move, but black does also have knight c6, which I think is probably the most fighting approach, where black usually gets good chances to play for a win. The idea in general is that white, if white goes something slow like c3, black usually wants to play for bishop d6 followed by knight ge7. And the knight arguably is actually better placed on e7 than on f3 in some cases, especially when black goes f6. Then the knight on f3 can never go to e5 anymore. And black also does have the, black also does have the idea to castle the queen side in some cases. So let's say white does something, I don't know, careless maybe, like bishop d3, knight e7, short castle. Bishop could come to g4 maybe, or even to e6 or f5. In general, black wants to exchange these two bishops. So the light squared this bishop against this bishop. Then black would be happy, because then these two bishops are left, and the bishop on c1 is worse because it has these pawns on the same color. So yeah, something like this, and black would follow up with queen d7 and long castle. So I think that this is kind of the best approach to play for a win, maybe. It was also played by Pragnananda in the candidates against Jan Nepomniachtchi, if I'm not mixing it up. But in that game, in this game, Ding played knight f6. Also, bishop d6 is one option. This is the last move I will talk about here. The point is after bishop d6, now white goes c4. Because usually after c4, black wants to be able to develop the bishop to b4 with check. But here, since the bishop is already on d6, it doesn't make a lot of sense to do so anymore. And after c4 now, the latest discussions have been knight f6, c5, bishop e7, when, yeah, black is still doing pretty okay here. But there have been a couple of ideas like queen a4, I think it was here. Let me check. There was also a candidates game. It was Nakamura against Firouzja, yeah. Queen a4 check, which does look a little bit strange, but the point is that whatever black does here, whatever piece he places in between the check, it does have some downsides. For example, bishop d7 is what Firouzja played, and after queen c2, the bishop is sometimes a little bit misplaced on d7. Also, c6 is not really a move which black wants to make, since the knight usually wants to go to c6, and I'm guessing that knight c6 right away could run into knight e5. So this is one idea for white to possibly play for something here, but it's also not that clear. Knight f6 is anyway like by far the main move, and now bishop d3. Just to explain my point from before, if white were to go c4 now, black doesn't have any problems because after bishop b4 check, knight c3, short castle, yeah, black has a very, very nice play. So bishop d3, the main move, and now Ding somewhat surprisingly went for c5, since the line with bishop d6 doesn't seem to me like there is anything going on there. White does have this idea with queen e2 check, bishop e6 and knight g5. By the way, just to point out, black could also go for bishop e7 here, or even queen e7, when this endgame is maybe a little bit better for white, but usually black is okay. I think white goes knight c3 here to threaten knight c5, knight b5 usually, and yeah. If black goes something like c6, white has this idea with knight e5, followed by either bishop g5 or f4. So white does keep some small initiative here, but I guess you could also make it work with the help of the engines. But what I was saying was that after queen e2 check, bishop e6, knight g5, queen e7, knight takes e6, f takes e6, this is one of the positions that can arise here. I actually didn't really find anything for white here. Last time I checked it, black does have both of the ideas, either c5 or knight c6 immediately. So for example, after castle, knight c6 could be an option, and after c3, black will push an early e5. Maybe it even works here right away. And even though white has the bishop here, bishop pair, black is usually very active. For example, a position like this. Yeah, white does also have this idea, I think, with knight d2 here, when now knight c6 is, I think, a bit inaccurate because after knight f3, white is able to exchange a couple of pieces, and an endgame like this is a little bit unpleasant for black. Now that the queens are off the board, black doesn't have any more play on the king side. Compared to this position, now that the queens are on the board, I would be sometimes a little bit scared of some knight g4s happening. So I think last time I checked at knight d2, now there was castle, and after knight f3, now the plan with c5 was a little bit better, when black also does have very active play, like knight c6 is coming, the pawn on d4 is somewhat weak. So I think this is not really an issue for black, but maybe I missed something while I was checking it the last time. But Ding went for c5, which is also a good move. Now c3. In general, if white castles short here, then c4 is the move, and after rook e1 intermediate check, bishop e7, bishop f1, there is this line here after castle b3 takes ab, when it seems like white has the better pawn structure, but actually black doesn't have any issues here. Knight to c6 comes, and whenever white goes c4, it does also open up the square on b4. On top of that, the pawn on d4 actually becomes quite weak. Now bishop g4, I could already imagine white being in some trouble, because bishop takes f3 is threatening, when white could not take back with the queen, because the pawn on d4 would be hanging. So yeah, therefore, this move c3 has seen some attention lately. I think also that Nakamura played it against Nijat Abbasov in the candidates. So this is definitely a good try for white. This is also what I wanted myself, if I would play the French exchange with the white pieces. And here Ding played c4, which when I checked it the last time, I didn't really like it. I know that the engine claims that it's the best move, but I will get to that in a second, why I think it can be a bit risky. Knight c6 is the move I would probably play myself, and after short castle cd4, knight d4, just bishop e7, and some position like this is maybe a little bit better for white, but I usually never really felt the danger here with this isolated pawn. Black does also have his own active ideas, for example, a6 followed by bishop d6, c7, and then queen d6 is often an idea, just to set up a battery here. And yeah, it usually seemed like Black has enough active play here for the isolated queen's pawn. But c4 was played in the game, and as I said, it's probably the best move from an objective point of view, bishop c2, and this is now the whole point of going c3 right away, so that the bishop can retreat to c2, where it's of course way more active than if it had to go back to f1 or to e2. Bishop d6 was played, and now queen e2 check happened in the game. Now I have to say that short castle was actually the move I was a little bit afraid of as black here, last time I checked it. And even though the engine screams 0-0 here after knight e5, I felt like the position looks a little bit dangerous for black, because knight c6, for example, f4, and white has a fairly simple plan. Queen f3 will come, maybe knight d2, and then white will just push his pawn g4, g5. And it's a little bit strange to me to play this position as black, because this counterplay with b5, b4 seems a little bit slow here. So this could be something which white could try. I think there are not many games here, but yeah, this was my issue here as black in this line. But Gukesh went for queen e2 check, which is also a nice try. Now queen e7, and after a couple of moves here, rook e1 check, king f8 takes on e8, king e8, we reach this position where Gukesh played knight bd2, which allowed Ding to equalize pretty comfortably with h6 and now knight h5. And Ding even had some pretty big advantage later on, because now Ding simply wants to go g5, and after bishop g3 just gain the bishop pair. So what might have been better after knight bd2 instead of knight bd2, but of course if you don't know this move it's probably impossible to find it, is knight h4. The point is now if black goes h6, white has knight f5, attacking the bishop on d6 and the pawn on g7. And yeah, white will keep some advantage. For example, bishop h2 check, king h2, take on g5, take on g7. Knight will come back to f5, knight d2, and black still has some questions to be answered here. And after knight h4, g6, now a4 was a pretty good prophylactic move, because after something like knight d2, black would have nice counterplay with b5, followed by b4. So here a4 was a move which was suggested by the computer, and it still seemed like black has some issues here, because knight d2 will simply come, maybe rook e1, maybe white will also bring a knight to e3. Also one plan is to go g3, knight g2, and then bishop f4 to exchange these bishops. So here it still seemed like white does keep some small pull in this position. To just review it briefly, as I said, I think the best for black is just to go for this line with bishop d6 here. I didn't really see an issue here, and if you want to go for c5, of course this line with c4 is playable, but you need to know your lines pretty well here. What would be easier is just to go for a structure like this with cd4 and bishop e7, and yeah, I think those are the two best solutions for what was played by Gukesh. So next up we got Ding's London ideas. So these were two games. The first game was in round 6 and the second one was in round 10. So I thought I would analyze both of them just in this one section altogether. Let's start with the idea which he showed in round 6, which is actually not that much of an idea. I would say it is somewhat common theory. Let's just get into the positions. So in the first game, Ding started, in the 6th game, Ding started with this move order with bishop f4 on the second move. In the 10th game, I think he started with knight f3 first. And in the 6th game, so their first London game, this is the position they reached when Ding played this line with bishop b5 check, which is a bit tricky. I think Magnus Carlsen was one of the first to deploy it in some Rapid or Blitz World Championships a couple of years ago. Must have been already in 2016 by now. And the idea is quite simple, that knight c6 is basically the only way black can stop this check, since no piece can go to d7, since then the bishop on d6 will be hanging. And after bishop b5 check, knight c6, white simply takes here, takes on d6, and goes queen a4. And white's idea in general here is to go queen a3 when this pin on the pawn and the queen can be somewhat unpleasant. Black mostly castles here. The same idea is actually if black takes on d4. After cd4, c takes d4, short castle, queen a3 is kind of the same idea. So white really needs to stop c5 from happening here. If he does manage to do so with queen a3, for example, if black were to go in this endgame, it's not that much for white, but this pawn on c6 is still backward. And yeah, white does have better minor pieces, I would say, because the bishop on c8 is somewhat of a passive piece. And if this knight, for example, could arrive on c5, it would be already pretty bad positionally for black. So yeah, this is the whole idea here. But short castle is okay objectively for black, even though it does allow queen a3. This was the game which they had, knight e4, and now knight fd2. So as far as I understand it, white wants to take this knight from f2, since if he would take this knight, then whenever white would take here, then the knight on f3 is hanging after d takes c4. I think this is kind of the point. So knight fd2 is played, and here Gukesh went for e5, which is, I think, the first move of the engine. And yeah, I won't go into that much detail here. I'll just briefly show how the game folded out. After e5, knight takes e4, d takes e4, queen takes e5 happened, queen g6, knight d2, queen takes g2, long castle, queen takes f2, and the position is just a mess, basically. It has still been played, at least I have one correspondence game in front of me. And after d takes e5, rook b8, knight c4, this is how their game went, Ding against Gukesh, round 6. And here Gukesh went bishop e6, and yeah, later on we got this heavy piece endgame where Ding had some advantage here, even though it was still very complicated. Instead of bishop e6, queen f3 was played in the correspondence game. Also somewhat of a mysterious move. I guess he's just prophylactically avoiding white from doubling the rooks on the d-file, since now the rook cannot move here because the rook on h1 is hanging. And after queen f3, the game concluded in this move repetition. Yeah, not entirely obvious. So since this line with e5 is pretty complicated, and honestly, last time I looked at it, I wasn't very happy with it from the black side. I analyzed this, I had a fresh look upon it, and I found this one idea which might be quite interesting here for black, which is f5. So f5 has the point that whenever white takes on e4, black wants to recapture with the f pawn, and all of a sudden the f line opens up, and the pawn on f2 is somewhat yeah, somewhat of a target. By the way, f5 is a novelty, and I think it's quite an interesting one. And if white isn't careful, it can go wrong pretty quickly for him. So I analyzed the most logical moves here, at least hopefully. I thought that knight takes e4 is first of all logical, and after f takes e4 for white just to capture the pawn on c5. But here it turns out that black has two interesting options. The first one is just to go into this endgame, and even though black is a pawn down, the bishop will come into a6 and then d3, and white's knight is pretty useless here. Black will put at least one of his rooks on the b-file as well. Then after that, even rook b5 could be one idea, possibly regaining the pawn on c5, and still the pawn on f2 is pretty weak. So this endgame looked very decent for black, in my opinion. And there was also one option after queen takes c5 to simply not allow the queen trade with queen b8, targeting the pawn on b2. And this position actually got pretty dangerous very soon. b3 I thought was logical, bishop a6. Again, important, just bringing in the bishop to d3, where it's super powerful when the white king cannot castle anymore. And after a couple of more moves, when white plays somewhat logically, taking a couple of pawns here, white is actually lost here already because of queen c8, which I felt like was another instructive idea. First of all, white can now not move his knight because the pawn on c3 is hanging. And the other idea of queen c8 is to go queen g4 when both queen e2 and queen takes g2 are pretty nasty threats. So knight takes e4 is probably not that good of an idea. The main line went f3, also short castle, which seemed pretty logical. Black can simply go rook b8 when after these exchanges, sometimes the pawn on b2 could be hanging, so b3 is what I checked, and now e5 leads to a pretty good version of all of this for black, since rook b8 and b3 is included. Also, white has already castled short, compared to Ding's game. So that brings me to the main line, which is f5, f3, and here still e5 was the move. So once I saw this, I kind of had to include it in the in this analysis, and the position is super interesting, which arises. So I thought white should probably take the piece here. If white doesn't, which also would be understandable, if he castles short, then knight g5 was important, not to exchange those knights, because if black takes here on d2, white is actually happy to get rid of one of those knights. But yeah, knight g5 is strong, and now this knight on b1 actually cannot develop, so the trade would actually favor white quite a lot. So knight g5 is strong, and after queen takes c5, queen h6 was another nice point, since after d takes e5, knight e6. Now black wins back the pawn on e3, possibly also the pawn on e5, and black will still have some attacking chances, like bishop a6 is in the mix, rook b8 always, and white's knights are still not fully developed. Anyway, the main line was after e5 for white to take the piece, and yeah, here I had to click a bit to fully understand what was happening, since black is just a full piece up, a piece down after f takes e4, queen takes e5, but the attack just keeps going, queen h6, and white has to find a couple of only moves here. So first of all, the pawn on e3 is hanging, so white has to take on e5, and now after bishop g4, again, white has to find the only move, knight f1. Otherwise, in many cases, there will be queen h4 check, which would force g3. Let's say white plays a move like knight a3. I guess that queen h4 check, g3, queen h3 would be pretty nasty for white, because the queen will come into g2. So knight f1 has to be played now that queen h4 can be answered by knight g3. But here queen g5 is the idea. And now actually black has basically a mating threat, which is queen f5 followed by queen f2. So white has to again find an only move, which is queen d4, to be able to answer queen f5 with queen d2. And after queen d4, black can just play this incredible move h5. And it's, funnily enough, it's actually not easy for white to get his king into safety, because yeah, the bishop on g4 is just an absolute monster, and once it's there, white simply cannot castle. Again, knight bd2 would lose immediately due to queen f5 when queen f2 checkmate would be coming. I still checked knight a3, but now it's just h4, and the idea with h5, h4 is just to completely avoid knight g3. And here, some moves like knight c2, rook a b8, black will also have this idea with rook b7, rook f7, when all of a sudden the rook might come into f2. So I felt like this idea with f5 is very interesting. It is quite deep. I'm not sure that this line will come that often, but it's useful to have it in your repertoire. I mean, if you play this line, then bishop b5 check is probably by now the main move. So it definitely makes sense to have it ready. This brings me to the 10th game of the match, where Ding played this move bishop e2 here, which is actually a tricky move. Again, if you play the setup with the black pieces, it's definitely useful to know this. Gukesh didn't know it, and still he got a pretty playable position. He played bishop d6, so he just played the same like he would do after c3. But now white's point is that he wants to take on c5, and the pawn is still on c2. So after bishop takes c5, he wants c4, and now all of a sudden we have some sort of queen's gambit position, which is also pretty solid for black. But at least Ding was able to surprise his opponent, and still the position is not that equalish. It is equalish, but black still needs to be a bit careful to ensure full equality here. And the game went on pretty logically here. But Ding did keep some edge. After knight h5, he went bishop g5. Instead, I think that knight e4 would have been a bit of a better try, since it would be nice for white to get his knight to c5, for example, after knight f4, knight takes c5. I think I checked b6 here, after this was the best for black, but also this position doesn't look that healthy, because the pawn on c5 is just a target. So this was best for black in this position, but if this is the best against bishop e2 on move 2, then bishop d6 is probably not the best. The same also applies for knight c6. After short castle, bishop d6, again, d takes c5 would come, and we would transpose to what we have just seen. So this brings me to the solution of bishop e2 for black, which is the move queen b6. Of course, not an easy move to make if you're not familiar with the sideline bishop e2. but it's again useful to have it if this setup with the black pieces is your main choice. And queen b6, honestly, I did not really see that much what Ding had in mind. I guess that knight c3 had to be the move. There was also the move b3, but it just looks very, very weakening, and black has many decent moves here. Knight c6 is very logical, also bishop d6 now, and this position is just absolutely nothing for white. So b3 cannot really be it. Short castle, I saw that it was possible to play like this, since queen takes a1 is not a good idea, because after queen c2, the queen will be trapped on a1. But here, black can simply develop with bishop e7, short castle, and white cannot even force a draw here with rook b1. And this because the queen will actually come out. So white would have to play something like d takes e5, and white does have enough compensation, but not more than that. Black can maybe simply recapture, move the queen back, and then recapture with the queen on c5. So there were a couple of choices here for black. So that brings me to what I suspect was Ding's preparation, which is knight c3, which at least brings some imbalance into the position. And here again, black does have quite a couple of moves. I thought the most logical one is bishop d7, and I would also play that as black. I also let my stockfish run to depth 60, and also a6 was at least objectively okay. Also c4, even though I don't like that move from a practical point of view, because white will now, the center is closed, and white can even think about maybe playing knight d5 and g4, g5 later on. So I think bishop d7 is a good move. And here after short castle, bishop e7, by the way, taking on b2 is always pretty dangerous, especially here. If you take right away, knight b5 would come when knight c7 is a threat, and the queen on top of that on b2 could be trapped in some cases. So yeah, bishop d7, short castle, now bishop e7, and here again there were a couple of choices. I thought that d takes e5 might have been Ding's idea, and after queen takes c5 again, couple of setups. Bishop d3 would be kind of in Richard Rapport style, then to play something like a3 followed by b4, and later on e4 just to break in the center. It does look a little bit easier to play for white perhaps, but yeah, it's far from being an advantage. Another funny idea which I saw was queen takes c5, knight d2 here to immediately get e4, but yeah, it also does look pretty strange, and black was not in any trouble after short castle, even bishop c6 to just avoid e4 right away. But short castle, e4, and now queen b4, pinning the pawn and the bishop, and also attacking the pawn on b2. So here black seemed to be pretty okay. That being said, yeah, bishop e2, I think queen b6 is the easiest for black here. And in the other line, just to revisit what I had, I think that this f5 novelty here in this position is quite an interesting one, and could be definitely a nice surprise if you can prepare for that against your opponent. So this brings us to probably my favorite opening idea in this World Championship match, which happened in round 7 of the championship match. And this is where Gukesh found, or Gukesh's team found a very, very interesting idea in the symmetrical Grünfeld with g3 and g6. So this is how it happened: knight f3, d5, g3, g6, d4, bishop g7, c4, c6, bishop g2, knight f6, short castle. And this position is like fully analyzed, at least that's what people thought, until Gukesh unleashed the move rook e1 right here, which came as a shock to probably almost everyone. Like in this position, almost every move has been tried. It's somewhat like the Najdorf on move 6, where it's been so heavily analyzed that people have played almost anything just to try and get a game. Like ranging from the craziest move like rook g1 or bishop d2 even, or a3, a4, like anything has been played here. And it kind of reminds me of this position because white is simply running out of ideas, and therefore I'm even more excited that they found this idea with rook e1, which looks totally ridiculous at first, but if you take a closer look at it, it does make some sense actually, because in some cases, black will have to take on c4, and whenever he does, which Ding also did in the game, then e4 will just be coming, and the rook on e1 is all of a sudden very useful. First of all, to understand the rook e1 line, I think it's important to understand the knight c3 line right away, which was also played by Magnus Carlsen, and this is also quite an interesting line itself. Here, the point is that after d takes c4, white also plays for e4, but here b5, often black has the idea to go b4 right away, when the knight on c3 is sometimes kind of in the way for white because black gets to attack it with b4 right away. And now with rook e1, if black takes and after e4, he does not have this counterplay with b5, b4 against the knight anymore. So here white does have other ideas like bring the knight to d2, or also knight a3 to c2. And another idea, which I haven't even mentioned yet, is that now if black goes bishop g4 right away, which was in fact played by Ding, now white has the choice, has the option to go knight bd2. Which also, if we go back to the knight c3 line here, after d takes e4, e4, bishop g4 is one of the most serious moves here as well. And here, just to continue a little bit, after h3, bishop f3, e5 is the main idea for black, and after d takes e5, knight d7, black will win back the pawn, and yeah, black is somewhat holding his ground here. Still not such an easy line for white. There is the game Magnus Carlsen against Mamedyarov. I think it was Norway Chess 2022, if I'm not mistaken. Still not totally easy, but anyway, this is one of the ideas in the knight c3 line. And yeah, this is what happened in the Gukesh against Ding game, and now white has the option to go knight bd2. And here Ding went for the move c5, which is not the best, and it did give Gukesh an advantage. Now after d5, e6, h3. Also not the only move. I think that even knight takes e4 was one possibility when, yeah, often white can just sacrifice this pawn for a very, very active play, because after something like this, I assume that the diagonal would just go up, maybe knight e5 here. Looks pretty dangerous here overall, because also the pawn on b7 will be hanging very often. So this also would have been an option. Gukesh went h3 instead and also got an advantage here. Knight took on c4 later on, and Gukesh did have a winning position later on, but as we all know, the game ended in a draw. So c5 was not the best. b5 was in fact the best move, just hanging on to this pawn. But what is not entirely obvious is that after h3, black actually should not give up his bishop here on f3. Because it does look like if black can take here after knight f3, e6, that black is a pawn up, and he does have this very solid, like kind of a Slav structure. And you might even think that not having the bishop on c8 anymore might actually be a good factor for black, because anyway, it wouldn't be doing anything at all, basically, back there on c8, because it's kind of blockaded by its own pawns. But in fact, this position turns out to be pretty dangerous for black, because white has a very simple plan: just attack on the king side, h4, and after knight bd7, white could start with e5 and then go something like h5. But it was actually a funny motive, which is even stronger, is h5 right away. The point is, okay, black doesn't want to take on h5 with a pawn, because it does seriously damage his pawn structure in front of his king. And if knight takes h5, now white has e5 when g4 is coming, and black's knight is just trapped. So this idea with h5 was just pretty entertaining to me. Anyway, after h3, black should go back with the bishop to either c8, or I think also d7 was possible. And this brings us to a very unclear position. Just the computer liked a3 to guard. Actually, there was one important idea with a3. Let's say black goes something like, I don't know, bishop b7. White wants to go b3 often. And now after c3, knight b1. This is the main point. And now black doesn't have b4 anymore. Like, just to put it into perspective, if after bishop c8, white goes b3 immediately, then there's c3, knight b1, and b4. So this is the whole idea of a3, and the position is just unclear. Yeah, something like a5, maybe white will go b3 here, I assume. And after take some position like this, it does resemble the Catalan. White will have this long-term positional compensation. He does have the center and the nice square on c5. So this is one of the ways, but I still haven't said what I would actually play with black against this rook e1 idea, which is most likely bishop f5 right away. So here I wasn't entirely sure what Ding had in mind. I suspect that it would be queen b3. The funny idea with bishop f5 is, if white goes knight c3, then I want to go d takes c4, and after e4, bishop g4. So now we have the 7 knight c3 line, just with the rook on e1, which actually is a bad inclusion for white. I'll show you why. It's because after h3, takes e5. This is exactly the same position we saw before, just the rook is on e1. Now d takes e5, knight d7, still the same, e6, takes bishop e3. We're following the same theory, just that the rook is on e1. Still queen e7, bishop g2, and now knight e5. And now we can see the rook on e1 is actually misplaced because knight d3 will come with the tempo. So probably Ding intended to go queen b3, but here queen b6, knight c3 does kind of transpose to the queen b3 line on move 7 here, because black queen b6 is also not the only move here, but it's one of the main moves. And here knight c3, bishop f5 is often played. Also rook d8 I think is one of the moves, and white does actually go rook e1 in some cases here as well. I checked this position a little bit more just to be sure here. After queen b6, knight c3, I found this almost new move e6, which looks pretty safe for me. I know that the bishop on f5 is now often somewhat in danger to get trapped with h3, g4, but it's actually pretty safe here on f5. After bishop f4, the important idea was h6, because now black will have his own ideas with g5, for example, after h3, g5, and then the bishop can retreat at any moment. So this move bishop f5 seemed pretty easy. If you like taking on c4, then I would suggest you look into knight a6 here. Instead, Ding played bishop g4, which I already mentioned. Knight a6 with simply the idea that knight b4 to d3 could come. And yeah, still white does have some ideas. I suspect that knight a3 might be the best, since after a3 black can go knight d7 when e5 is probably coming pretty soon. And after knight a3, b5 just hanging on to the pawn, knight c2, knight c7, it brings us to a very complicated position. And this is probably what Gukesh wanted to play. So I think that the most clear-cut solution after rook e1 is bishop f5, and it's probably what I would do with black as well. All right, in this section, we're going to have a look at round 8, where Gukesh played this very interesting and basically completely new idea in the English. Which is not only kind of an opening idea, but also kind of a strategical novelty. I don't know if this happens very often, but it was very surprising to many, also very experienced chess player, to see what Gukesh has done. So Ding played c4 in that game, Gukesh played e5, knight c3, bishop b4, which is an interesting line. I've also played that pretty often with black myself. The idea is just to avoid the main lines with knight f6, knight f3, knight c6. And here with bishop b4, it kind of leads to pretty different positions. If white goes knight f3 now, black can take on c3, or even go d6. Yeah, now black doesn't have to go with the knight to f6. Especially that's a good point after bishop takes e3, b takes e3, d6. Black often goes f5, knight f6, and it just leads to kind of a reversed Sicilian Rossolimo type of position, which I always pretty much liked with black. So yeah, it does avoid the main lines. Same after g3, black can also take on c3 now, and again, the knight still being on g8 might favor black in some of the variations. So Ding played knight e5, which is the main move, targeting the bishop on b4, and Gukesh went, I would say, for the modern main line, which is bishop e7. I've played myself pretty often this move a5, which has the idea that when white takes the bishop pair, now the rook on a8 joins the game pretty nicely, and the pawn on e2 is actually kind of a long-term target, and black mostly follows up with c5, knight c6, knight e7, short castle, and then either d6 or d5, when black actually has a very good game. So after a5, most white players go a5, a3, bishop c5, and now something like knight f3, d6, e3 is the theory, and usually some position like this arise, kind of like a I don't know, like a Philidor, I would say, with the bishop already on a7. So I would say it's a better version than a Philidor. I've always very much liked these positions. The point why a5, a3, the inclusion is so important here, because if bishop c5 right away, which is also a move, white has the ideas with b4. And if a5 and a3 are included, then b4 doesn't work anymore, because black can simply take. But anyway, Gukesh went bishop e7, and now Ding went for knight f3, d6, g3, which I did not really know that much before. I was only familiar with, I would call it the main line, which is d4, and now e takes d4. queen takes d4, knight f6, knight e7, queen e7, bishop g5, knight c6, queen c3. And here I knew that after d6, usually these endgames after bishop f6 tend to be pretty okay for black, even though he has the double pawns here. Black has a lead in development and will follow up with bishop e6, long castle, knight e5, targeting the pawn on c5, on c4, and often even he can free himself with d5 when overall black gets a lot of active play. Knight f3 was another move here, and where I just wanted to point out that there is this interesting move, rook g8, which has actually been played a couple of times. Yeah, just total influence by the computers. The point is just black is preparing for white to take on f6 when the rook will be pretty useful on the g-file. And I think if white goes something like e3, I think black wants to go to e6 or f5 just with the bishop and then castle queenside. But anyway, I would probably play knight e5 here, which does seem a bit more human. And after knight takes e5, both queen takes e5 and d takes e5 are very solid for black. So it's tough, this line for white. Ding therefore went knight f3, d6. And now he went g3, which does keep a lot of pieces on the board and also keeps the position closed. And yeah, here Gukesh went for this new idea, which is c6, knight takes c7, and now knight takes c7. When I was commenting this game live for Lichess, I thought that queen takes c7 is kind of an automatic move, just to follow up with knight f6 and then short castle. But it turns out that this position is actually a bit unpleasant for black. Even though he gets the center with d5, white goes b3, puts the bishop to b2, and yeah, now the dark squares are somewhat weakened, and the bishop on b2 is a very nice piece. So talking about dark squares, that's how Gukesh invented this new idea: knight takes c7, knight takes c7, bishop d2, and now this idea with f6. So everyone was shocked when we saw this, basically. It just looks so strange to put the knight to e7 and then f6, d6, e5. But the whole concept behind this is actually pretty brilliant. So now black wants to just castle next and then push d5. So short castle happened, bishop e6, even a more accurate move order, forcing white to do something first. And after b3, now Gukesh went d5. And equalized fairly comfortably. If d3, I saw that the computer even suggested the move queen d7, and after something like rook b1, bishop h3, b4, even h5, and black has a pretty strong attack with h4 to come. So this was even another idea. I think though that after b3 it didn't work that well, because after queen d7, I guess white can go at least he can go bishop a3, maybe even play in the center with d4 now, since the pawn on c4 is now protected. So this was played in the game, b3, d5, bishop a3, castle rook c1, and now we're just arrived at the middle game. One more thing I would like to point out here is the very interesting plan which Ding has played, namely knight e1 followed by f4, which I've never seen before either. But Gukesh played the middle game pretty well and ended up actually having a winning advantage. Then Ding was winning, and then later on the game ended in a draw. But yeah, that's all I had to say about the opening stage. So this brings us to the last part of this video, which is actually today's game, which ended in a decisive result when Gukesh won against Ding Liren with the white pieces. And yeah, it was round 11. And Gukesh again played knight f3, not going for the French, d5, c4, d4, and now b4. This pretty old line which hasn't been seen on, at least on a top level, for quite some time, or at least not that often. In general, white doesn't really allow this type of Benoni structure on the top level, at least, anymore. But of course, it does lead to very unbalanced positions, and black still needs to know a couple of things here. I was wondering a bit why Ding didn't go e6, because as far as I've seen, he does go for the queen's gambit, or at least some sort of queen's gambit. Yeah, maybe he wanted to avoid this certain variation, which would also explain why he went for knight f3, d5, g3, g6 in a previous game. Anyway, he went d4, which there's nothing wrong with it, and now Gukesh went for b4. One other line is e3, where I can still remember one of my first coaches, I think, told me this plan here for black, and since then, it was like in 2015, it stayed in my mind. It was this knight c6, and there was this old line for white to take here and go knight c3, with the plan to push away the queen with d3 followed by bishop e3. But here there's this nice idea for black. I think it was c6 right away, d3, and now knight h6. So black is not threatening, black is not worried that white will take here, because g takes h6 will come, followed by rook g8, taking control of the g file, and the bishop is just super strong. It will come to g7 or even to c5, and black has already has a nice position here. So what white would do is something to go bishop e3 and then maybe still d4, but black in most cases will win this nice bishop on e3. So this plan with knight h6 since then stayed in my mind, and I think it's pretty useful to know that as well. But Gukesh went for b4 in that game, and Ding went for c5, which I also play myself with the black pieces. There are a couple of other lines, like f6 is one of the very complicated main lines, when I think after e3, e5, c5, this leads to the there are lots of things here. White often has this idea with queen a4 check. I think it's even immediately after a5 there's queen a4, these sorts of ideas. When whatever piece black puts in between, it's somehow misplaced, like bishop d7, now white goes b5 often, and the point is now that the knight on b8 can hardly develop. I think this is one of the theoretical lines here, which are pretty dangerous for black, so I wouldn't want to go there with the black side. Ding went for c5. I just want to point out this nice sideline as well, g5, which is actually fully playable. Last time I was checking it. The point is, if white captures this pawn, then after e5, black will gain a tempo on the knight, and it has to go to some strange squares often, I think knight e4. And yeah, if white goes d3, there's bishop takes b4, of course, I have to point that out. So white goes to e4, then often to g3 or some strange squares, and yeah, black does have pretty nice compensation here overall. White, of course, can also play h3. Also, another nice trick is queen b3 here, with the point that g4, knight takes d4 wins a pawn, because black cannot take, because the rook on h8 will fall. And yeah, as I said, also h3 is one idea, when black can at least go for some position like h6, when the space advantage on the king side actually often favors black. He will follow up with bishop g7, e5, knight e7, often f5 later on. And yeah, this line with g5 is definitely playable, even though for a world championship match I would be a bit surprised to see it. So Ding went c5, and e3 was played by Gukesh. White could also go for some Benko Gambit reversed, but yeah, black is usually pretty happy to see that, since the Benko Gambit yeah, is even not that great if white is a tempo up. So Gukesh went e3, and here Ding went knight f6, which he has played already before. He's developing like this because knight c6 right away could run into b5 here. So knight f6, this is still theory, and here Gukesh played the surprising move a3, which I have never seen before in my life, and it was actually the first game played in over-the-board chess. Before that, all of the games here have been correspondence chess. I have to point out that Ding faced this line already before, when against Adiban, who played b5 here, and here there are two good moves, queen c7 or knight d7, both offering the pawn sacrifice on d4, but black gets very active play here. Ding did play knight bd7 against Adiban in that game. Adiban took the pawn, which is not a great idea, and it turned out to be pretty dangerous here, and Ding actually won a very nice game here. Instead of taking the pawn here, d3 is probably better, but after e5, g3, black does have the important idea to have counterplay on the queen side with a6. Yeah, queen c7 is another move where I remember this game between Oparin and Wojtaszek in a certain Grand Prix. I think it was in Berlin, 2022 or 2023. And also something similar happened here. White took the pawn like this, but black did end up with a very good position because white is just very slow in development here. But back to Gukesh's idea, which was a3, which is just protecting the pawn on b4 for now. Yeah, it's kind of asking black how he wants to develop, because knight c6 still can be answered by b5. Before I continue this, I just want to say that here d takes c3, f e3, c takes b4 is of course also very logical. But white does get like a reversed Blumenfeld gambit, which is definitely playable. Something like this, black usually develops with g6, bishop g7, and white usually wants to play a3, take with the bishop, even better now in one move. Yeah, then follow up with something like knight c3. Often the queen goes to the king side, and white does have a pretty nice initiative for the sacrificed pawn. So Ding went knight f6, a3, and here, yeah, Ding was spending a lot of time already for knight f6, which was pretty mind-blowing, and also for bishop g4 he spent half an hour, which is not the best move. It's still certainly playable, but it was a surprising move to see nevertheless, because black usually doesn't give up his light squared bishop in these structures. So the best move, which is not really obvious at first, I would say, is knight c6. It does run into b5 here, but white already had this move a3, and black has knight f6. So if we go back here, knight c6 here wouldn't be great, because after b5, knight e5, white doesn't have this move a3, but black still has the knight on g8, which is of course a very good comparison for white here. So knight c6 is the best move, and after b5, now knight a5. And I think that Gukesh's idea here was to go d3. Still, now the knight on a5, of course, is misplaced, but it probably, in the long run, it will be okay for black. D takes e3 seems very logical to me, also the best move. Now, bishop takes e3, probably what Gukesh had in mind, and here if black develops fairly normally with b6 and then g6, the position seemed pretty playable for me here. This is where I stopped. And of course the position is also playable for white. There's nothing to say against it. The knight on a5 is of course still somewhat out of the game, but white can never really push d4, because then the pawn on c4 would be hanging. And the pawn on d3 is a backward pawn here, which could definitely be a target. Like black could maybe double his pieces on the queen side. Also knight g4 could be an idea, harassing the bishop on e3. And yeah, this position overall seemed okay for black. Of course also for white. So yeah, that's I think what Gukesh had in mind here. Since all the other options haven't been that convincing to me. There was also a correspondence game in 2021 where white played d3, but after taking here and going e5, this was how the game went, and black has compensation numerous ways in the correspondence game. Bishop e7 happened, bishop d6 seems even more straightforward to me, and after takes knight f3, just castle, and later on a6 will come, and black has very nice counterplay for the sacrificed pawn. So yeah, I think Gukesh would have gone for this, and yeah, if white actually takes on d4, not allowing d takes e3, then after cd4, d3 again, black does have this important idea with a6, and it leads to a pretty balanced position. Black definitely doesn't have the worst chances here. So yeah, knight c6 is kind of the solution here. a5 also does look logical, I felt like, but here b5 is probably a bit annoying, because now the important thing is that black doesn't have the usual counterplay with a6 on the queen side anymore, and white will just follow up with d3, g3, bishop g2, something like that, and probably he has the nicer position here. By the way, b takes e5 is never that good of an idea, because now knight c6 will come, and then e5, and the pawn on c5 will sooner or later drop on c5. So yeah, a3, interesting idea, definitely for one game, like a one-game idea. And knight c6 seems to neutralize white's chances, even though the position, of course, is still playable. So overall, a nice idea. And yeah, that concludes this video now. I think it was a pretty long one. Let me know what you think of this new concept, looking at new opening ideas, because I know from my own experience that it's often tough to follow all of the developments. There are so many tournaments happening pretty often, and it's hard to keep an eye on all of them. But that's something I really enjoy doing, and therefore I also enjoy presenting you my findings, and I hope you find it useful. If you did, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel, and other than that, I will see you in the upcoming videos.